It is December 17th, 1944, before dawn. The Ardennes forest lies silent under a crust of frost. The trees are black silhouettes against a pale, bruised sky. From somewhere deep in the valley, an engine coughs once and dies. The sound fades into stillness. A column of German tanks, machines that once shook Europe, sits motionless on a narrow country road. Their engines are cold. Their crews, shivering in the brittle dark, whisper to one another. Not because they fear the Americans, but because they fear something worse, the silence of empty fuel tanks. One officer climbs out from the turret of his tank. His breath fogs instantly. He taps the metal hull with his glove, once, twice, as if willing it to wake up. Nothing. He stares down the road, where the rest of his armored column stretches in a jagged, frozen line. Dozens of tanks, hundreds of trucks, thousands of men, all waiting for fuel that isn't coming.
This man, a German colonel, has spent the last 5 years believing in victory through steel, speed, and willpower. But today, for the first time, he begins to understand. Willpower cannot refill an empty tank. Hours earlier, the offensive had begun, a desperate gamble ordered from the highest levels. The goal was simple on paper: break through the thin American lines in Belgium, split the Allied armies, reach Antwerp, force peace on German terms. But paper goals don't run on fumes. And already, before the sun even rises, the spearhead of the German attack has come to a halt. Then, as if fate offers one final mercy, a scout comes running from the village ahead. He is shouting, waving his arms, pointing toward a cluster of buildings at the edge of the forest.
The colonel orders his men forward. They move cautiously. The village is eerily quiet. Doors open, fires still burning in stoves, American mugs of coffee sitting on tables, steam curling upward. And then they see it. Rows of steel drums, stacks of jerry cans, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Fuel, gasoline, the very thing their army has been starving for. Men begin to cheer, some cry. Others drop to their knees and cross themselves. The colonel walks to one of the drums. He opens the cap. The sharp scent of high-octane fuel hits him. He closes his eyes and breathes in slowly. 50,000 gallons. Enough to refuel his entire column. Enough, perhaps, to reach their objective. The men rush to work, siphoning, pumping, refilling tanks that had been bone dry. Engines cough, roar, and come alive again.
For a moment, hope returns. For a moment, they believe the offensive is saved. But then, something strange happens. The colonel doesn't smile. He looks around at the endless rows of fuel cans, stacked carelessly, left behind as if they meant nothing. His expression darkens. He realizes that this miracle is not a victory. It's a revelation. Because if the Americans can leave behind this much fuel without a second thought, if they can burn it, abandon it, or replace it overnight, then Germany is already defeated. He doesn't say it aloud. Not yet. But somewhere deep inside, he knows. The story of that moment, of that 50,000 gallons, is not just about one village, one tank column, or one battle.
It's the story of an entire war reaching its breaking point. A war that was decided not by generals, but by logistics. Not by courage, but by fuel. To understand why this mattered, we need to go back, months earlier, to the factories, pipelines, and refineries that fed the machines of war. Germany's war machine was built on a fragile foundation: synthetic fuel. With no great oil reserves of its own, it had turned to chemistry. Coal turned to liquid fuel through hydrogenation, a marvel of engineering, but also a weakness. By 1943, Allied bombers knew exactly where to strike. Luna, Bleckhammer, Politz. Names that once stood for industrial strength now stood for smoking craters. Each bombing run crippled production further. By the summer of 1944, the entire Reich was producing barely a fraction of what it needed. Trains were running half-empty. Air squadrons were grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Even the mighty tanks, the symbols of German power, were rationed like candlelight in a blackout.
Meanwhile, across the ocean, America was drowning in oil. Texas, Oklahoma, California, pipelines stretching like veins across a continent, refineries working day and night, tanker ships crossing the Atlantic in endless convoys. In 1944, the United States refined nearly 2 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany managed less than 30 million. A gap so vast it couldn't be closed by any tactic, any courage, any miracle weapon. The Americans turned logistics into an art form. Fuel pipelines ran under the English Channel, the Pluto system, pipeline under the ocean. Convoys known as the Red Ball Express carried thousands of tons of supplies each day from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. To feed one Allied army for a single day required millions of gallons of gasoline, and they delivered it every day without fail. The Germans saw it happening. They intercepted reports, decoded signals, captured supply manifests, but they couldn't comprehend the scale. How do you fight an enemy who can burn more fuel denying it to you than you produce in an entire month? By late 1944, Hitler's high command knew the truth, even if they wouldn't admit it. The Ardennes offensive, the grand counterattack, was their last throw of the dice. Its success depended entirely on one impossible hope: that they could capture American fuel depots along the way. The plan looked bold. It was, in reality, desperate. Each Panzer division received only enough fuel for about 50 miles of movement. Their objectives lay twice that distance away. The rest of the fuel would have to come from the enemy. And so when our colonel found those 50,000 gallons in the Belgian village, it felt like destiny. He radioed command, reporting success. Headquarters replied with cautious encouragement. Continue advance, capture additional supplies where possible. He obeyed. But inside, the message burned like acid. Capture fuel where possible, as if victory could be scavenged. The column moved out again. Engines rumbled. Snow churned beneath treads. The smell of gasoline clung to the air, but progress was slow. The roads were narrow, clogged with ice and debris. Each delay consumed more of that precious fuel. By nightfall, the column had advanced barely 20 miles, and the gauges were already sinking again. The colonel stood by the roadside, watching his tanks idling in the cold. Every minute wasted meant another liter burned. He turned to his adjutant. "Shut them down," he said quietly. "Every engine, every one that isn't moving." Men obeyed in silence. Engines died out one by one, leaving only the sound of wind. The colonel looked toward the dark horizon, where, somewhere beyond the forest, the Americans waited. He thought of the fuel dump behind them, now empty. 50,000 gallons gone, and yet they were no closer to victory. He thought of the Americans, what they might have in reserve. Hundreds of depots, millions of gallons. He could almost see them, somewhere beyond the fog. Convoys of trucks, endless, unstoppable. He whispered to himself, though no one could hear. They have oceans. We have drops. The forest stands in silence once more. The moment of hope has passed. The German column, fueled and restless, inches forward through the narrow, icy roads of Belgium. They move through villages that look abandoned, yet still echo with the traces of their former inhabitants. Children's shoes by the doorway, half-eaten bread on the table, a radio left on, whispering static. Everywhere there are signs of a hasty retreat, but not of panic. The Americans had not fled in chaos. They had moved back in control, and that difference lingers in the colonel's mind. By afternoon, the road curves into a valley, and the convoy halts again. An overturned truck blocks the path. Beyond it, a bridge lies shattered. The wooden planks smolder, blackened from a controlled demolition. The colonel climbs down from his tank. He knows what this means. The Americans are not running. They are shaping the battlefield. He studies the wreckage in silence. The pattern is deliberate. Just enough destruction to delay pursuit, not enough to trap his own men in a permanent halt. The enemy knew precisely what they were doing. He calls his engineers forward. They begin repairs, dragging timbers, hammering, shouting in the cold. Every blow of a hammer burns time and fuel. By the time the bridge is patched enough to carry the first truck, the light has already begun to fade. The colonel glances at his wristwatch. He calculates fuel left and distance remaining. The numbers don't add up. That night, he sets up a temporary command post in an old farmhouse. The walls are cracked. Snow drifts in through the windows. He lights a lantern and studies a captured American map. Red lines mark supply routes, depots, convoy hubs. He circles one name with his pencil, Stavelot, a town rumored to hold another large fuel depot. If they can reach it by morning, they might refuel again. If not, the offensive dies here. He calls his officers together. They gather around the table, their breath visible in the cold. One asks how much fuel remains. The colonel answers truthfully, enough to reach our next prayer. They nod in grim silence. No one laughs. Morning. The air bites harder now. The column moves out again, crawling like a metal serpent through snow and fog. Each truck is loaded to the brim with extra fuel cans. Every drop they captured is precious. But the road climbs steeply now. Engines strain. Some vehicles stall. Others slip and slide into ditches. They push them out by hand. The effort costs more than sweat. It costs time, and time costs fuel. By midday, smoke rises in the distance. Dark, oily smoke, the kind that comes from burning fuel. The men quicken their pace. Engines roar, tracks grind against the road. They burst through the edge of the forest and stop. What they see steals the breath from their lungs. The fuel depot is burning. Columns of fire climb into the sky. Black smoke rolls across the valley. Drums explode one by one, each like a thunderclap. American engineers, before retreating, have torched their own supplies. The colonel watches in silence. Some of his men curse. Others stare, mouths open, in disbelief. Thousands of gallons of gasoline, destroyed intentionally. To the Americans, it was routine. To the Germans, it is unthinkable.
He turns to his adjutant, who mutters, "They burn it rather than let us have it." The colonel doesn't reply. He just stares at the flames and says quietly, "They can afford to burn it." The words hang in the air like ash. The fire burns for hours. When it finally dies down, the ground is slick with oil and mud. The colonel orders the men to move on. There's nothing left to salvage. They pass through the ruins of the depot, twisted metal, melted barrels, the acrid smell of fuel vapor. And then, lying half buried in soot, the colonel spots something. A U.S. jerry can, still intact, half full. He lifts it, feels the weight. The symbol of everything that divides the two armies. The American jerry can, mass-produced, light, durable, perfectly sealed. The German version, heavier, prone to leaks, impossible to manufacture in the millions. One side refined logistics to an art. The other turned desperation into doctrine. He holds the can for a moment, then sets it back down gently.
Night falls again. The men are exhausted. Engines cough weakly. The last drops of the captured fuel are gone. He gathers his officers once more. No orders come from headquarters. The radios are silent. They are alone now, deep in enemy territory, surrounded by an ocean of fuel they cannot reach. For the first time, the colonel allows himself to feel the weight of it, the realization that he commands not a spearhead, but a stranded relic, a column of ghosts moving through a war that has already been decided. He steps outside, staring up at the night sky. Somewhere beyond the clouds, he imagines the faint glow of Allied bombers heading east. Bombers filled with high-octane gasoline made possible by factories his country no longer possesses. He whispers to no one in particular. It was never about courage. It was about who could keep moving. Across the lines, the Americans are moving too. Convoys stretch from the port of Antwerp to the front. Thousands of trucks, driven day and night by men barely older than 20. They call themselves the Red Ball Express, an rolling artery of fuel, food, and ammunition feeding the Allied advance.
The drivers know the stakes. If they stop, the front stops. If they keep going, the war ends sooner. Mud, snow, exhaustion, it doesn't matter. The trucks roll on, each one carrying up to 700 gallons of fuel. Each gallon the result of a global network of wells, refineries, pipelines, and ships. The United States had become a logistics empire, an oil civilization with wheels and wings. A single American refinery could produce more fuel in a day than the entire German army consumed in a week. To keep those trucks moving, the Allies built new roads, repaired old ones, even laid pipelines alongside. They called it Operation Pluto. Pipelines running under the English Channel, delivering millions of gallons straight to France. When the colonel's tanks stopped in Belgium, American fuel was already flowing beneath the seabed, unstoppable.
But for the German soldiers on the ground, those invisible pipelines might as well have been rivers on another planet. All they knew was hunger, cold, and the smell of engines gone still. In one captured diary, found years later, a German tanker wrote, "We dream of fuel, not food, not home, not victory, just fuel. We are no longer an army. We are an engine without oil, a heart without blood." The colonel might have written the same words himself. He just never had the time. At midnight, his adjutant reports the last of the trucks have stopped. They cannot move. The gauges are empty. The colonel nods. He orders the men to dig in. set up defenses, and wait for dawn. In the distance, the glow of another burning fuel dump paints the horizon. He knows what it means. The Americans are burning everything ahead of them, denying his army even the illusion of progress. The Ardennes offensive, the great gamble, is bleeding out, not from bullets, but from thirst. He leans against the side of his tank, its armor cold as stone. For years he believed this machine was invincible, that it could force history itself to bend. Now it is just metal, heavy, silent, useless.
He looks at his reflection in the steel, and for the first time he sees not a conqueror, but a survivor waiting for the inevitable. Morning comes gray and brittle. The tanks stand frozen in place, their long barrels pointing at nothing. Snow has drifted halfway up the treads. Men sleep where they fell, wrapped in coats stiff with frost. The colonel walks between them, boots crunching softly. He smells oil, smoke, and the faint sweetness of frozen rations. Somewhere in the distance, artillery murmurs like distant thunder. He looks to the east, toward home, and then to the west, where the sky glows faintly orange. That glow is not dawn. It is another depot burning. He knows it before anyone reports it. The pattern is clear now. Every mile they advance, the Americans light another fire. Every fire means another dream reduced to smoke. He gathers his men. Their faces are hollow, eyes red from cold and sleeplessness. He speaks quietly, his words short, deliberate. We move at first light, no fuel to spare. We fight on foot if we must. They nod. No one questions the order. Obedience has replaced belief. They move out, engines silent, most vehicles abandoned by the roadside. A once armored column now walks through the forest like refugees. The wind howls through empty turrets. In the ditches, they leave behind weapons too heavy to carry. One soldier looks back at the line of lifeless tanks and murmurs, "It looks like a graveyard." The colonel answers, "It is." Across the valley, American artillery begins its work. Shells arc overhead, bursting in white flashes among the trees. The forest trembles. Snow falls from the branches like ashes. The men dive for cover. The colonel drops behind a log, shouting orders, his voice drowned by the roar. He feels the concussion of each blast through the frozen ground. The shells aren't accurate. They don't need to be. The message is enough. The counterattack has begun. When the barrage ends, silence returns, heavier than before. He checks his map. The front lines have folded. Units to the north are retreating. Supplies are gone. Communication is broken. He radios headquarters. Static answers him. He tries again. Still nothing. Only the thin, whispering hiss of an empty channel. He lowers the handset slowly, staring at the snow. That hiss sounds like the last breath of an army. By the next night, word spreads through the ranks. The Americans have retaken the burning depots, pushed back the spearhead, and sealed the roads behind. The offensive is trapped. Men begin to surrender in small groups. Others simply disappear into the forest. The colonel does neither. He stays. Because to leave would mean admitting that everything, the campaign, the faith, the years, were for nothing. He walks among the wrecks again. One tank has its hatch open, snow piling inside. He climbs up and sits on the turret, watching the horizon. The battlefield stretches below like a graveyard of steel. Engines silent, tracks broken. the smell of burnt oil thick in the air. For the first time in the war, he allows himself to think not as a soldier, but as a man. He wonders how many barrels of fuel, how many trains, how many factories had been needed to create this silence. He remembers the 50,000 gallons, the miracle that became a warning. He understands now that those gallons were not hope. They were a mirror showing the truth. Germany could capture fuel, but it could not create it. And a war that cannot create will always lose to one that can.
Somewhere beyond the fog, American trucks rumble. Headlights sweep the dark like slow-moving stars. Each truck carries fuel enough to drive a tank farther than his whole column advanced in days. The colonel watches them from the ridge. He does not order fire. He simply watches, fascinated, defeated, almost in awe. It occurs to him that he is seeing not just an army, but a civilization built on motion, an empire of engines. And he, standing in the snow, is part of a world that has already stopped moving. He whispers under his breath, "They will keep moving long after we stop." High above, bombers cross the sky, unseen but unmistakable. He hears their steady drone and knows what they carry: more fuel, more fire, more certainty. Each engine overhead is a sentence in the story already written. He thinks of his soldiers now scattered, of his homeland starved and bombed, of the promises that led them here. He realizes the truth that no one dared say aloud, that the war was lost not today or this week, but years ago, when the factories fell silent and the refineries turned to ruins. The rest was only momentum. He closes his eyes. For the first time, he feels something close to peace, not acceptance, but understanding.
The engines that once terrified the world are silent. The fires that once burned with purpose now burn only to deny. And the last great gamble of the Reich has ended the way all machines do when the fuel runs out, in stillness. At dawn, American patrols find the village. They move cautiously, rifles ready, nerves tight, but the forest offers no resistance, only cold, dead tanks and the faint smell of burnt gasoline. They find the colonel sitting beside his vehicle. He does not move. His pistol lies in the snow beside him. He has chosen surrender over illusion. The young American sergeant who approaches him barely looks old enough to shave. He offers a cigarette. The colonel takes it, nods once, and lights it with trembling hands.
No words pass between them. None are needed. The sergeant glances at the wreckage around them and says quietly, "Hell of a waste." The colonel exhales a cloud of smoke. "Yes," he says, "a waste of everything." As prisoners are gathered, the Americans record inventories, destroyed vehicles, abandoned supplies, fuel consumed, fuel captured, fuel burned. In the official reports, the numbers are precise. In human terms, they are immeasurable. The 50,000 gallons that once promised salvation became the symbol of futility. They gave motion for a few more miles, enough to see how far behind history had already left them.
The war moved on. It always does. Within weeks, the last German spearheads in the Ardennes had been pushed back. The roads once clogged with tanks and wrecks were now filled with American convoys rolling east. The great counteroffensive, the final hope of the Reich, had evaporated into smoke and cold fog. The colonel became a prisoner among thousands. He was marched west, past villages flattened by artillery, past columns of refugees trudging toward an uncertain peace. He spoke little. He no longer thought of victory or defeat. He thought only of engines, of fuel, of movement, of what keeps a world turning. As he and the other prisoners were herded through a small Belgian town, he saw an American depot, neat rows of fuel drums stacked 3 stories high. A convoy was loading up, engines idling, drivers laughing over tin cups of coffee. To them, it was just another morning. To him, it was a revelation made visible. He turned to one of his men and whispered, "They will never run out again." In the years that followed, historians would count victories and defeats by battles and borders. But deep in the ledgers of fuel production and tonnage, the real story was written in numbers. The United States had delivered more than 90 million barrels of oil to Europe by war's end. Germany's entire wartime output, from every synthetic plant, every captured field, every desperate experiment, barely matched a few months of Allied consumption.
The war that began with tanks and thunder ended with tankers and tonnage. In the ruins of Germany, factories lay silent. The once mighty synthetic fuel plants, Luna, Bleckhammer, Perlitz, stood as skeletons of steel. The air still smelled faintly of burnt chemicals. When the colonel was released years later, he passed one of those ruins on a train. The chimneys were cracked, the pipelines twisted like veins drained of blood. He pressed his hand to the window and whispered, "It ended here, not on the battlefield, here." Across the ocean, the United States emerged changed. Its highways widened. Its refineries multiplied. Its war machine became its peace machine. Automobiles replacing tanks, jetliners replacing bombers. An entire civilization learned that the key to power was motion, and motion was fuel. But there was a cost in the memory of those who had seen the fires firsthand.
The colonel settled into obscurity. No speeches, no memoirs. He lived in a small town, repaired machinery, kept to himself. Neighbors said he spent hours staring at his car before starting it, as if asking permission from the past. Once, when a young journalist asked him what he thought of the war, he said only, "We lost it the day we mistook energy for eternity." He meant that machines are only as strong as what feeds them, that industry, resources, and will are threads of the same cloth, and when one thread snaps, the rest unravels. The world moved on again. The Cold War dawned. New empires rose. New engines roared. Oil became the new currency of conflict, fought over deserts instead of forests. But somewhere, deep beneath those modern battles, the same lesson waited, the one written in that winter of 1944. An army runs on belief, but it survives on fuel. Imagine again that Belgian morning, the frozen road, the silent tanks, the miracle of 50,000 gallons glistening in the cold. For a few fleeting hours, it seemed like salvation, but it was never salvation. It was the mirror showing the truth. The Americans could afford to leave oceans of fuel behind. The Germans could not afford to lose a single drop. And that difference, invisible to the eye, measurable only in barrels and miles, determined the fate of millions.
The colonel understood it in that moment, standing amid the fuel drums. Power is not in the weapon, but in the supply line that keeps it alive. Not in the courage of men, but in the invisible network that lets them move, eat, and fight another day. That is the real front line of any war, the one no monument ever marks. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Europe exhaled. The guns went silent, engines cooled, and humanity stood at the edge of a new age, the age of machines without limits. Fuel would rebuild what it had destroyed, but the lesson would linger, buried beneath prosperity and progress. That empires, no matter how mighty, end not with explosions, but with exhaustion.
So when historians speak of strategy, of generals and genius, remember this. Sometimes history turns not on courage or cunning, but on something as simple, as fragile, as a drop of gasoline. In that silence, the colonel's words returned, whispered once into the cold Ardennes air. They have oceans, we have drops. And with that, the war and an entire world finally stopped moving.